Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey, not with knights or queens, not with battles or grand empires, but with something far quieter, far more humble, and perhaps far more powerful. We're going to trace the epic story of a single, unassuming blade of grass that bent the course of human history. From a wild whisper on the wind to the warm, comforting loaf on our tables. This is the story of wheat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. It helps paint a picture of us all, listening together in the quiet hours. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's travel back in time, not just a few centuries, but back to the very edge of recorded memory, to a time before the first king, before the first city, before the first word was written down. Picture a world bathed in the golden light of a late afternoon sun 10, maybe 12,000 years ago. We are standing in a place historians would one day call the Fertile Crescent, a sweeping arc of land curving from the Nile up through modern-day Turkey and down into the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates. But for now, it has no name. It is simply the world. There are no roads, no fences, no borders. Just an endless expanse of rolling grasslands, punctuated by groves of pistachio and oak trees, with the hazy silhouettes of distant mountains framing the horizon. A warm, dry wind sweeps across the plains, and it carries the only sounds you can hear: the rustle of a million blades of tall grass, the distant cry of a hawk circling on the thermal currents, the gentle hum of insects in the warm air. There is no hum of cities, no rumble of wheels, no echo of human argument. The world is a quiet place, a patient place, a place that is simply being. You can feel the sun on your skin, a gentle, persistent warmth. You can smell the earth, a dusty, sweet scent mixed with the fragrance of wild herbs crushed underfoot. This isn't a harsh, unforgiving landscape. It is a land of abundance, a garden of sorts, but one without a gardener. It is a world that exists in a perfect slow-motion balance. Rivers carve their paths through the soft earth. Seasons turn with a predictable grace, and life follows its ancient, unwritten rhythms. This is the world as it was, a silent canvas waiting. And in this vast, quiet garden, among thousands of other plants, grows a particular kind of wild grass. It is nothing remarkable at first glance. It's just one small part of the immense green and gold tapestry that stretches to the horizon. But this is where our story truly begins. Now, let's draw our focus closer, down from the sweeping vistas of the landscape, and kneel in the tall grass. Let your eyes adjust to the intricate world at your feet. Here, swaying gently in the same warm breeze, is the ancestor of all wheat, a wild grass known as einkorn or emmer. It doesn't look like the robust, heavy-headed wheat of today. Far from it. It is slender, almost delicate, with a thin stalk and a small, unassuming seed head. It wasn't a hero of the plant world. It wasn't strong or imposing. It was a quiet survivor, a master of its environment, and its genius lay in a single remarkable trait: its fragility. Touch the seed head, the spike, with your finger. The slightest pressure, a sudden gust of wind, the brush of a passing animal, and the entire structure shatters. It disintegrates into a dozen tiny pieces, each one carrying a precious seed. The central stalk that holds the seeds, what botanists call the rachis, is incredibly brittle. It's a marvel of natural engineering, a promise designed to break. Its entire purpose was to let go, to shatter, to release its children to the wind, allowing them to scatter far and wide, to find new soil to plant themselves, and to begin the cycle all over again. This was its survival strategy, a strategy of dispersal, of surrender. It never tried to hold on. It never tried to hoard its wealth. It simply cast its future to the four winds, trusting that some of its seeds would find a home. You can almost hear it, a faint, dry crackle, as the seed head ripens and falls apart, a whisper of falling seeds that is the plant's only voice. It was an existence defined by release, a life spent in a constant, graceful act of falling apart. And for thousands upon thousands of years, this is how it worked. The grass lived, it shattered, it spread, all without any help, all without any notice. It was just another quiet miracle in a world that was full of them, waiting patiently for a new kind of attention, a new kind of relationship that would change its destiny and ours forever. And into this quiet world, this landscape of whispering grasses and shattering seeds, walked our ancestors. These were not farmers. The idea of planting a seed and waiting for it to grow was a concept that had not yet been born. These were the last of the great hunter-gatherers, people who lived in small nomadic bands, moving with the seasons, their lives an intricate dance with the world around them. They were masters of their environment, not through domination but through observation. They knew the patterns of the migrating herds, the places where the best flint could be found, the times of year when the rivers would swell with fish, and they knew the grasses. Imagine you are one of them. Your life is a rhythm of movement, of walking. The earth is not something you own. It is something you pass through. Your home is a temporary shelter of hides and branches. Your possessions are what you can carry on your back. But your mind holds a library of knowledge, a map of resources passed down through generations. You know that when the air grows warm and the days grow long, certain hillsides will turn a pale shade of gold, and you walk towards them. This wasn't an act of labor, not in the way we think of it. It was an act of discovery, of gathering. You would arrive at a vast field of this wild wheat, and you would begin to collect it. This was a slow art, a quiet patience, a deep understanding. You couldn't simply grab the seed heads because they would shatter in your hands, their precious cargo lost to the ground. Instead, you would use a basket, or perhaps just your cupped hands, held carefully beneath the spike. You would gently tap, gently persuade the ripe grains to fall. It was a partnership. The grass offered its seeds, and you, with your knowledge and your careful touch, accepted the gift. Hour after hour, you would move through the fields, your basket slowly growing heavier. It was a meditative process, a conversation with the land. You might collect enough in a few days to feed your family for a few weeks. Then, you would move on, following the ripening seasons, following the herds, leaving the wild grasses to seed themselves for the next year. You weren't changing the world. You were living within it. But even in this simple act of gathering, a selection process had begun, a silent, unintentional negotiation between human hands and wild grass. You would naturally favor the plants whose seeds were the largest, the most nutritious. And sometimes you might accidentally carry a few seeds with you, dropping them near your next camp, giving them a small head start in a new place. You aren't a farmer, not yet. You were a gleaner, a partner, the first human hand to guide the destiny of wheat, all without ever knowing the profound consequences of your patient, wandering gaze. Then something happened. It wasn't an earthquake or a flood. It wasn't a great discovery or a heroic deed. There was no thunderclap, no flash of lightning. It was a change so quiet, so subtle, that no one at the time could possibly have noticed it. It happened deep within the genetic heart of a single stalk of wild wheat, a tiny accidental rewriting of its biological code. A silent mutation. For millennia, the success of wild wheat had depended on that brittle rockies, that fragile spine that shattered and scattered its seeds. But in one random, fateful instance, a plant was born with a mutation that made that spine tough, resilient, stubborn. On this particular plant, the seeds no longer fell away at the slightest touch. They clung to the stalk, even when they were fully ripe. Even when the wind blew, even when an animal brushed past, they held on. In the grand scheme of the wild world, this was a failure, a defect. This plant was a terrible parent. It couldn't effectively spread its own seeds. Its offspring would likely cluster right at its base, competing for the same patch of soil, the same drops of water, the same rays of sunlight. Left to its own devices, this genetic lineage would probably have withered and died out within a few generations, a forgotten evolutionary dead end. It was a plant that had forgotten how to let go. But it was not left to its own devices, because into that same field, that same season, walked a human gatherer. Imagine that woman moving through the sea of grass with her basket. She taps one plant and the seeds rain down. She taps another and they do the same. But then she comes to this strange, mutated stalk. She taps it. Nothing happens. The seeds remain stubbornly attached. She might be puzzled for a moment, but then, driven by curiosity or hunger, she does something new. Instead of just tapping, she plucks the entire seed head, the whole spike, in one piece. It is a moment of profound, unintended consequence. In her basket for the first time are two kinds of wheat. The individual shattered grains from the normal plants, and this one intact, whole spike from the mutated one. And as she carries her harvest back to her camp, a subtle shift in the balance of power has occurred. The wild wheat's future is no longer just in the hands of the wind. It is now quite literally in the hands of humanity. She didn't know it. She couldn't have. She was just gathering food for her family. But in that simple act of choosing the spike that held together, she had cast a vote. She had picked a winner. And in doing so, she had unwittingly grabbed the reins of evolution, steering this humble grass and all of us toward a future no one could have possibly imagined. That single, tougher spike of wheat carried back to the camp was more than just food. It was a possibility. It was a question waiting to be answered. As the days and weeks went by, the presence of this new, more cooperative grass began to subtly alter the rhythms of human life. The old way was constant motion, a life of following, of chasing, of drifting across the landscape in search of what nature provided. But this wheat, the wheat that held together, offered a different kind of promise. It offered the promise of a reliable harvest in one place. Picture the slow, dawning realization. The gatherers noticed that in the places where these non-shattering wheat plants grew, a harvest was easier, more efficient. You could collect far more grain in a single day. You could come back to the same patch year after year and find it waiting for you. And so, the ancient patterns of migration began to fray at the edges. The constant wandering began to slow. Why walk 100 miles to follow a herd of gazelle when right here on this sunny hillside was a field of grain that would feed you for months? The decision wasn't made in a single moment. It wasn't a grand council or a dramatic choice. It was a slow, gravitational pull, a gentle tethering. People began to stay longer in the places where this mutated wheat thrived. The temporary camps once used for a few weeks now lasted for a whole season. Huts became a little more permanent. Storage pits were dug into the earth to protect the surplus grain from pests and moisture. For the first time, people were not just passing through the land, they were settling into it. This was the birth of the first semi-permanent villages. Small clusters of round stone-based huts nestled in the protective curve of a river valley overlooking a field of wild cooperative grain. Life was still hard, still precarious. But something fundamental had changed. The focus had shifted from the horizon to the soil at their feet. People began to observe the life cycle of this plant with a new intensity. They watched as the first green shoots pushed through the earth in the spring. They watched as the stalks grew tall and golden under the summer sun. They learned to read the subtle signs of ripeness, to know the perfect moment to harvest. They were becoming experts, not just gatherers but custodians. They would clear away competing weeds. They would scare off hungry birds. They were protecting this precious resource, investing their time and energy in its success. This wasn't farming, not in the way we know it. It was a deep, intimate partnership. A long, slow courtship between a species of primate and a species of grass. Humanity was putting down roots, both literally and figuratively, drawn into a new kind of stillness, a new kind of life, all because a single plant had forgotten how to let go, and in doing so had taught humanity how to stay. And then came the final revolutionary step, the one that would transform humanity from a participant in the natural world to a shaper of it. It likely happened without ceremony, without any sense of its own historical weight. It was probably a simple, practical act, born of observation and a flicker of inspiration. Someone, a woman perhaps, returning to the settlement with her basket full of those tough, intact wheat spikes, looked at the bare patch of ground near her family's hut. And she had an idea. For generations, her ancestors had simply taken what the world offered. The world was the garden, and they were the guests. But now, holding these seeds, these tiny packages of life that she herself had chosen and collected, she saw a different possibility. What if she didn't have to walk to the fields? What if the fields could come to her? Imagine the scene. It's early evening, the air is cool, the sun is setting, casting long shadows across the small village. She takes a handful of the harvested seeds, not the ground flour for that night's meal, but the whole living grains. She walks over to that patch of cleared earth. The soil is dry and dusty. She kneels down with a pointed stick, or maybe just her fingers. She scratches a shallow furrow in the dirt. Then, one by one, she drops the seeds into the ground. There was no magic spell, no prayer to a forgotten god of the harvest. It was a quiet, deliberate experiment, an act of trust. She was placing these seeds, this food, this potential life into the darkness of the earth, with nothing but a hope that they would re-emerge. After she was done, she would have covered them gently with soil, maybe brought a skin full of water from the nearby stream to give them their first drink. And then she would have waited. This was the birth of agriculture. It wasn't an invention. It was the culmination of 1,000 years of slow observation of a relationship that had deepened over countless seasons. It was the moment humanity stopped just asking nature for its gifts and started a conversation. It was a simple gesture, placing a seed in the ground. But in that gesture was the blueprint for everything that was to come. For the first village, for the first city, for the sprawling civilizations that would one day rise and fall. That first, tiny, hand-sown plot of land was the most radical thing our species had ever done. It was a declaration of intent. It was a commitment to one place. It was the first stitch in the fabric of a new world, a world where humans would no longer just be wanderers on the face of the earth, but cultivators, creators, and caretakers. All of this, all of our history, all of our triumphs and our struggles began right there, in a quiet moment, with a single person kneeling in the dust, planting a seed, and in doing so, planting the future. Now, our story shifts. The quiet, rolling hills of the Fertile Crescent fade behind us, and we travel forward in time and southward in geography, to a place where civilization would erupt in a blaze of gold and glory. Our journey takes us to the banks of a river. Not just any river, but the river. The lifeblood of a kingdom, the cradle of gods and pharaohs. We are in ancient Egypt, and the air itself feels different. It is thick with heat, heavy with the scent of lotus blossoms, and the damp, fertile smell of the earth after a flood. Here, wheat was not just a clever discovery. It was a divine gift, the very foundation upon which one of the world's most enduring civilizations was built. And it all began with the rhythm of the Nile. Every year, like a faithful breathing creature, the great river would swell. Fed by the distant summer rains in the heart of Africa, it would rise above its banks, spilling out across the narrow, flat valley. For weeks, the world would become a sheet of brown, swirling water, the villages and temples transformed into small islands in a vast, temporary sea. To an outsider, it might have looked like a catastrophe, a destructive, chaotic flood. But to the Egyptians, it was a miracle. It was the annual act of creation. Then, just as predictably as it had risen, the water would recede. It would pull back, shrinking into its channel, leaving behind its incredible gift. A thick, black, glistening layer of silt. This was not just mud. It was a treasure trove of nutrients. A perfect pre-fertilized seedbed, rich with the life-giving minerals carried for 1,000 miles. The Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land, in honor of this dark, precious soil. And into this soil they cast their wheat. There was no need for the heavy, back-breaking work of plowing that would define farming in other parts of the world. The river had done the work for them. Farmers would walk through the soft, damp silt, broadcasting handfuls of grain. Sometimes they would drive herds of sheep or goats across the newly sown fields, their hooves gently pressing the seeds into the earth. And then, under the relentless gaze of the Egyptian sun, life would explode. The wheat grew with a speed and abundance that seemed supernatural. The valley, once brown and black, would transform into a vibrant, shimmering sea of green, which in turn would ripen into a landscape of solid gold. The Nile's gift was a harvest so reliable, so bountiful, that it created something humanity had never seen before on this scale, a massive, consistent surplus of food. And that surplus changed everything. It was the fuel that powered the pyramids, the currency that paid the armies, the security that allowed a complex society of priests, scribes, artisans, and rulers to flourish. The entire magnificent edifice of Egyptian civilization, with its intricate gods and its monumental architecture, rested on the slender, golden stalk of wheat, born from the river's generous annual embrace. In the heart of the Egyptian world, wheat was never just a crop. It was a sacred substance, a physical manifestation of life, death, and rebirth. Its journey from a tiny seed to a golden stalk, to a loaf of bread that nourished the body, mirrored the Egyptian understanding of the cosmos itself. It was woven so deeply into their culture that to separate the two would be impossible. The story of wheat was the story of Egypt, and the most tangible form of that story was bread. This wasn't the simple, flat, unleavened bread of their ancestors. The Egyptians were the world's first great bakers, and they discovered, perhaps by a happy accident, the magic of fermentation. Imagine a bowl of ground wheat and water left out too long in the warm yeast filled Egyptian air. Wild yeasts, invisible little life forms, would have drifted into the mixture, consuming the sugars in the grain and releasing tiny bubbles of carbon dioxide. The dough would have begun to rise, to puff up, to become light and airy, as if filled with a mysterious breath of life. When this living dough was baked in their conical clay ovens, it transformed into something new, a soft, porous, leavened loaf. It was a revelation. This was not just sustenance, it was a delight. Egyptian bakers became masters of their craft, creating dozens of different shapes and types of bread. Some were simple, everyday loaves for the workers. Others were elaborate creations, shaped like animals or humans, sweetened with honey or dates, and offered to the gods on temple altars. Bread was everywhere, and was a form of payment for the laborers who built the pyramids. It was a staple of the soldier's ration. It was the centerpiece of a pharaoh's banquet. To be without bread was to be truly poor, truly lost. But its significance went even deeper into the realm of the divine. The god Osiris, one of the most important deities in their pantheon, was inextricably linked to the grain. He was the god who died and was reborn each year, just like the wheat that was cut down at harvest and then grew again from the seed planted in the black earth. Small Osiris-shaped figures were sometimes fashioned from clay and silt, filled with wheat seeds and watered. As the seeds sprouted, covering the figure in a carpet of green, it was a powerful living symbol of resurrection. It was a promise that just as the grain returned from the darkness of the soil, so too could the human soul find eternal life after death. So when an Egyptian ate a piece of bread, they weren't just filling their stomach. They were partaking in a sacred cycle. They were consuming a piece of a god's promise, a taste of eternity, a reminder that even in the face of death, life, stubborn and golden, would always find a way to rise again. Now, let's close our eyes and listen. Tune out the imagined sounds of the bustling markets and the grand temple ceremonies, and focus on a quieter, more persistent sound. It's a sound that formed the background hum of daily life in ancient Egypt for thousands of years. It is the slow, rhythmic, grinding song of the saddle quern. It is the sound of turning grain into flour, the sound of women at work. Picture a simple, sun-baked courtyard. A woman kneels on the hard-packed earth. In front of her is a large, slightly concave stone, the saddle quern. In her hands she holds a smaller, rounded stone, the grinder. A pile of hard, dry wheat grain sits beside her, and her work begins. She places a handful of grains onto the quern, and then, with a steady, practiced motion, she begins to push and pull the hand stone across them. It is a slow, laborious process. Her body rocks back and forth, her shoulders and arms bearing down with all their weight. The sound is a gritty, scraping whisper, a constant, abrasive duet between stone and seed. Shh, shh, shh. It is the sound of transformation, the sound of something hard and whole being broken down, pulverized, turned into a fine, pale powder. Dust from the flour and tiny particles of sand worn from the stone fill the air, coating her skin and clothes in a fine white film. It gets into her lungs, into her food. The teeth of Egyptian mummies often show extreme wear, a testament to a lifetime of eating this gritty, stone-ground bread. This was a task that consumed hours of every single day, from the humblest village hut to the sprawling kitchens of the pharaoh's palace. This sound was a constant. It was the rhythm of the household, the first sound heard at dawn and one of the last heard at dusk. It was the sound of sustenance being made, the essential foundational work upon which everything else was built. There was no grand glory in it. No monuments were built to the women who spent their lives kneeling at these stones. It was repetitive, monotonous, exhausting work, often done by the lowest members of society, by servants or slaves. Yet, there is a certain hypnotic peace in the rhythm of it. A slow, steady, unceasing chant of stone on stone. It is a sound that speaks of persistence, of endurance, of the endless cyclical nature of providing for a family. It is the heartbeat of the ancient kitchen. As you listen to this imaginary sound, you realize that this is the true sound of civilization. Not the trumpets of war or the pronouncements of kings, but this quiet, humble, tireless grinding. The slow, patient, essential work of turning a golden grain into the daily bread that would feed an empire. The gift of the Nile could not be contained by its valley forever. Like the seeds of the wheat plant itself, the knowledge of its cultivation, and the grain itself began to travel. It journeyed not on the wind, but in the bellies of sturdy, broad-beamed ships, carried by the great seafaring peoples of the ancient world. The vast, blue expanse of the Mediterranean Sea, once a barrier, was transformed into a highway, a great liquid road connecting cultures and continents. And one of the most precious cargoes carried along this road was wheat. Imagine you are standing on a sun-drenched dock in a bustling port city, perhaps Byblos or Tyre. The air is alive with a cacophony of sounds, the creak of ropes, the shouts of sailors in a dozen different languages, the rhythmic hammering from a shipbuilder's yard. The air smells of salt, of cedarwood, of dried fish, and of something else, a dry, dusty, wholesome scent. It is the smell of grain being loaded into the hold of a ship. These are the ships of the Phoenicians, the master merchants of the ancient world. Their vessels, with their distinctive horse-head prows, were the lifeblood of Mediterranean commerce, and wheat was one of their most vital commodities. They sailed from the grain, rich lands of Egypt and the Levant, their ships riding low in the water, heavy with sacks of precious emmer and barley. They followed the coastlines, navigating by the stars and by the familiar shapes of distant mountains, their single square sails billowing in the steady sea breeze. It was a slow, patient process, a journey of 1,000 oar strokes and 1,000 patient glances at the sky. They were stitching the world together, one voyage at a time. With them, They carried not just the grain, but the idea of the grain. They brought the seeds to new lands, to the rocky shores of Greece, to the fertile islands of the Aegean, to the coasts of what would one day be Italy. And with the seeds, they brought the knowledge how to plant, how to harvest, how to turn this golden grass into the bread that sustained life. In each new port, a small act of transmission took place. A bag of seed was exchanged for a jug of wine, a bolt of purple cloth, or a bar of tin. A story was told. A technique was shared. The Greeks, with their insatiable curiosity and their love of logic, embraced wheat and made it their own. They learned to cultivate it on their terraced hillsides, adapting the farming techniques to their own unique landscape. For them, wheat became more than just food. It was a symbol of civilization itself. Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, became one of their most revered deities. Her story, the story of a mother's grief for her lost daughter Persephone, which brought winter to the world, and her joy at her return, which brought back the spring, was the story of the wheat's own cycle of death and rebirth. Bread and wine became the cornerstones of their diet, the simple, elegant fuel for their philosophers, their playwrights, and their soldiers. The golden routes of the sea had carried not just a plant, but a cornerstone of Western civilization passed gently from hand to hand, from shore to shore under the calm, watchful gaze of a Mediterranean sun. Now, our voyage takes us to the heart of a new power, a city that began as a small, unremarkable settlement on the banks of the Tiber River and grew to become the master of the known world. We have arrived in Rome, and if Egypt was built on the worship of wheat, Rome was built on the consumption of it. Here, wheat was not a gentle gift from a benevolent river. It was a tool of empire, a weapon of statecraft, a fundamental pillar of power, as essential to the Roman state as its legions and its laws. Walk with me through the streets of this immense, sprawling city. It is a place of staggered contrasts. Magnificent marble temples and forums stand beside crowded, rickety, 5-story apartment blocks, the insulae, where the vast majority of the city's 1 million inhabitants lived packed together. The noise is overwhelming. The air is thick with the smoke of 100,000 cooking fires, and the streets teem with a restless, volatile population. How do you feed a city this large? How do you keep a population this crowded from erupting into chaos and riot? The Roman emperors had a simple, brutally effective answer: panem et circenses, bread and circuses. As long as the people had cheap food and spectacular entertainment, they would remain docile. The circuses were the grand, bloody spectacles of the Colosseum and the thrilling chariot races of the Circus Maximus. But the bread was the real foundation of this policy. The Roman state took upon itself the monumental task of providing a grain dole, the cura inane, a regular distribution of free or heavily subsidized grain to hundreds of thousands of its citizens. It was arguably the largest social welfare program in the ancient world, and it was fueled entirely by wheat. To ensure this endless supply, Rome had to look beyond the fields of Italy. It had to conquer and control the great breadbaskets of the Mediterranean. Egypt, with its predictable, bountiful harvests from the Nile, became the personal property of the emperor, its primary function to serve as a giant farm for the capital. The province of Sicily, with its fertile volcanic soil, was another crucial source. Great fleets of grain ships, the Inanna fleet, plied the seas, constantly moving in a vast, organized conveyor belt of sustenance. These weren't the small merchant vessels of the Phoenicians. They were massive, state-sponsored cargo ships, capable of carrying thousands of tons of grain, all heading for the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber. The stakes were incredibly high. A delay in the grain fleet due to storms or pirates could lead to shortages in the city, and shortages led to riots. A Roman emperor's popularity, and indeed his very life, could depend on the timely arrival of the next shipment of Egyptian wheat. It was the engine of the empire, the silent, edible power that kept the heart of the world beating. Let us end this part of our journey by taking a step back, by ascending to a vantage point high above the noise and the crowds, and seeing the entire system as a whole. From this height, the Roman Empire reveals itself not just as a map of provinces and roads, but as a vast, living organism with a constant rhythmic flow of energy. And the lifeblood of this organism, the single substance that nourished its every part, was the tiny golden grain of wheat. Imagine the journey of a single particle of that lifeblood. It begins in the sun-scorched fields of North Africa, harvested by a tenant farmer who will never see Rome. It is threshed, winnowed, and poured into coarse burlap sacks. These sacks are loaded onto the backs of donkeys and carried down to the banks of the Nile, where they are loaded onto river barges. The barges drift slowly northward, joining 1,000 other vessels, all converging on the great port city of Alexandria. There, the grain is stored in massive state granaries, the Horia, before being loaded onto one of the giant ships of the grain fleet. For weeks, it crosses the Mediterranean, a tiny part of a colossal floating mountain of food, protected by the Roman navy. It arrives at Ostia, where it is unloaded by armies of dock workers, checked and recorded by imperial scribes, and transferred to smaller riverboats for the final leg of its journey up the Tiber to Rome. In the city, it is taken to the great public mills, powered by water or by the endless, circular toil of donkeys and slaves, and ground into flour. Finally, that flour is distributed to the populace, or baked into the simple, hearty loaves of panis quadratus, the bread that was the staple of the Roman diet. From a field in Egypt to a table in a crowded Roman insula, a journey of over 1,000 miles. It was a miracle of logistics, of organization, of raw imperial power. Each grain of wheat was a tiny edible brick in the immense structure of the Roman state. It fueled the soldiers who guarded the frontiers, the engineers who built the aqueducts, the politicians who debated in the Senate, and the ordinary people whose quiet consent was necessary for the entire system to function. The empire's conquests, its art, its philosophy, its law, all of it was underwritten by the silent, steady, reliable flow of grain. Wheat was not just food, it was order, it was stability, it was the very substance of Roman peace. A single, humble seed, multiplied 1 billion-fold, holding a world together. The colossal organism of Rome, with its insatiable appetite and its perfectly organized flows of grain, could not last forever. The heart of the empire grew weak, its arteries clogged, and eventually, the great system collapsed. The legions retreated from the frontiers. The aqueducts crumbled. The great sea lanes, once protected and bustling, fell quiet, haunted by pirates and the ghosts of a forgotten order. In the chaos that followed, a dark age descended upon Europe. Cities shrank, knowledge was lost, and life became a smaller, more local, more precarious affair. And in this fractured, uncertain world, the future of wheat, and the agricultural knowledge that sustained it fell into the hands of a new kind of guardian. Imagine a small island of tranquility in a sea of turmoil. It is a monastery nestled deep in a secluded river valley, its sturdy stone walls offering a defense not against armies, but against the chaos of the world outside. Within these walls, life moves to a different rhythm, not the rhythm of politics or commerce, but the slow, predictable, sacred rhythm of the bell, calling the monks to prayer, to study, and to work. And much of that work took place in the earth. Step through the heavy oak gate into the monastery's walled garden and fields. Here, the world is orderly, peaceful, and productive. Neat rows of vegetables grow beside fragrant herb gardens. Fruit trees are espaliered against the warm south-facing walls, and beyond the garden, stretching out towards the river, are the monastery's fields of wheat. Here, in these isolated pockets of civilization, the agricultural wisdom of the ancient world was preserved, like a precious seed saved from a fire. The monks were not just men of prayer, they were scholars and farmers. In their libraries, they painstakingly copied and preserved the old Roman agricultural texts, the works of writers like Columella and Varro. They studied the old techniques, learning about crop rotation, about the importance of good drainage, about the best times to sow and to reap. And they applied this knowledge with a devotion that was both practical and spiritual. For them, working the land was a form of prayer, an act of co-creation with God. To make the earth fruitful was to honor its creator. Picture a monk in his simple coarse, spun brown robe, his back bent to the task of scything the golden wheat at harvest time. His movements are slow, deliberate, and efficient, refined by years of repetition. He is not just a farmer, he is a steward. He and his brothers were not just growing food for their own sustenance. Their monasteries were often centers of innovation. They experimented with new crop varieties, with better methods of fertilization using manure from their livestock, and with more efficient tools. The surplus grain they produced would feed the poor and the pilgrims who came to their gates, and it could be sold in the small, re-emerging local markets. In a world where life for most people was a desperate struggle for survival. These monastic islands were repositories of stability and knowledge. They were the quiet, patient guardians of the flame of civilization, and that flame was fed, quite literally, by the wheat that grew within their walls. They were keeping the thread of history from snapping, ensuring that when the world was ready to rebuild, the foundational knowledge of how to turn a seed into a loaf of bread would not have been forgotten. As the centuries of the early Middle Ages slowly passed, a new kind of order began to emerge from the chaos. The world was still a small local place, but a rhythm was returning to the land, a predictable pattern that would govern the lives of millions. This new order was centered around the village, the manor, and the church, and its heartbeat was a system of agriculture that was both beautifully simple and profoundly effective, the three-field system. Let's rise above a single monastery and look down upon a typical medieval European village. It is a small cluster of wattle and daub huts with thatched roofs, all huddled together around a simple stone church and the slightly larger fortified manor house of the local lord. There are no isolated farmhouses. Everyone lives together for safety and for community. And radiating out from the central village are three vast, open fields. There are no fences or hedges dividing them into individual properties. These are communal lands worked by everyone. One of these fields lies fallow, unplanted, its soil resting and replenishing its nutrients, its surface covered in the weeds and grasses where the village livestock graze. The second field is planted in the autumn with a winter crop, most often wheat or rye, the essential grains for making bread. The third field is planted in the spring with crops like oats, barley, peas, or beans. And every year the fields rotate. The field that grew wheat this year will be planted with beans next year. The field that grew beans will be left fallow, and the fallow field will be plowed and planted with the all-important winter wheat. This was the rhythm of the year, a slow, unceasing waltz of planting, growing, harvesting, and resting. It governed everything. The calendar was not a series of abstract dates, but a cycle of agricultural tasks. Saints' days marked the time for plowing or for bringing in the harvest. The entire social and economic structure of the village was built around this shared work. Each family in the village was allocated a number of strips of land scattered throughout the 3 great fields. This ensured that everyone got a share of the good land and the less fertile land, a system that was fair but incredibly inefficient by modern standards. Imagine the scene at plowing time. A team of lumbering, heavy-shouldered oxen, yoked together, strains to pull a heavy wooden plow through the wet, dense soil. A peasant farmer walks behind, his hands gripping the plow handles, his voice calling out encouragement to the animals. This is a communal effort. The plow team was often too expensive for a single family to own, so neighbors would pool their resources, sharing their oxen and their labor. Life was a constant negotiation, a web of shared duties and mutual obligations, all dictated by the needs of the land and the crops. The seasons turned, and the fields changed color with them. The deep, dark brown of the newly plowed earth in winter, the vibrant, hopeful green of the young wheat shoots in spring, the shimmering, solid gold of the ripe grain in late summer, and finally, the pale, bristly stubble of the harvested fields in autumn. This was the world as the medieval peasant knew it, a world governed not by clocks or by kings, but by the sun, the rain, and the slow, steady, life-giving pulse of the 3-field system. For centuries, the quiet, gritty music of the hand quern had been the sound of flour making. It was the sound of human labor, of aching backs and sore muscles, of a task that consumed a huge portion of every day. But as the Middle Ages progressed, a new sound began to echo through the river valleys and across the windswept plains of Europe. It was a deeper, more powerful sound, a groaning, creaking, rhythmic song of wood and stone, powered not by human strength, but by the tireless forces of nature. It was the song of the watermill and the windmill. Picture a river flowing swiftly past a medieval village. A portion of its water is diverted into a narrow channel, a millrace, where it rushes towards a small, sturdy stone building. The water pours over a great wooden wheel, its force catching the paddles and turning the massive structure with a steady, relentless power. Inside the mill, a series of ingenious wooden gears and shafts transfers this raw, circular motion from the water wheel to a pair of enormous heavy millstones. The sound inside is a deafening, constant roar, a combination of the splashing water outside and the deep, grinding rumble of the stones inside. This was a technological revolution. A single water mill, tended by one miller, could do the work of dozens of women toiling at their hand querns. It could grind more flour, more finely, and more consistently than had ever been possible before. The miller became a crucial figure in the village community. He controlled the nexus point through which every farmer's harvest had to pass. The mill was often owned by the local lord or the monastery, and the peasants were required to bring their grain there to be ground, paying a portion of their flour as a fee, the multure. The miller was sometimes a respected figure, sometimes a resented one, often accused in folk tales of being a cunning thief who always took more than his fair share. But his mill was the humming, thrumming heart of the village's food supply. In the flatter, drier lands where powerful rivers were scarce, a different kind of giant rose against the skyline, the windmill. Imagine a low hill outside a village in Flanders or on the English coast. At its crest stands a wooden tower, a post mill, built so that the entire structure could be turned to face the changing direction of the wind. 4 great, canvas-covered sails, like the arms of a clock, turn slowly and majestically in the breeze. A deep, rhythmic whoosh, whoosh, whoosh fills the air as they pass, a sound that is both powerful and peaceful. Like its water-powered cousin, the windmill harnessed an elemental force to perform the endless task of grinding grain. It was a monument to human ingenuity, a partnership with the invisible power of the air. These structures, the watermills and the windmills, were more than just practical machines. They were symbols of a new era. They represented the slow, steady harnessing of natural power to lighten the burden of human labor. They were the first factories, the first engines of the medieval world. Their song, the steady groan of wood and the deep rumble of stone, was the sound of a society slowly, creakily, but powerfully, turning towards the future. While the fields of Europe were settling into their 3-field rhythm, and the creak of the watermill became a familiar sound, our story of wheat was unfolding in a different way, far to the east. The golden grain, which had been born in the Fertile Crescent, had been traveling for centuries, not just by sea, but overland, carried by the slow, patient footsteps of merchants and monks, soldiers and pilgrims. It was moving along the greatest terrestrial trade route the world has ever known, the Silk Road. Imagine a caravan of camels, their bells chiming softly in the dry, high-altitude air of Central Asia. They are moving through a landscape of stark, breathtaking beauty, vast empty deserts, and snow-capped mountains that pierce a brilliant blue sky. These caravans were the threads that stitched the great civilizations of the West and the East together. They carried silk, spices, and porcelain from China, and they brought back gold, glass, and new ideas from the Mediterranean world. And tucked away in their cargo, a humble but persistent traveler was wheat. The journey was incredibly long and arduous. Wheat was not a primary luxury good like silk, but it moved as a staple for the travelers themselves, and as a cultural passenger, a seed of an idea that would slowly take root in new lands. It passed through the great oasis cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, and eventually it found its way over the high mountain passes and down into the river valleys of China. Here, it encountered a civilization that was in many ways as old and as sophisticated as Egypt's, but one that had been built on a different grain, rice. In the warm, wet, fertile lands of southern China, rice was king, but in the cooler, drier plains of the north, wheat found a new and welcoming home. The Chinese farmers, with their millennia of agricultural expertise, adapted this foreign grass to their own soil and their own climate. But more than that, they adapted it to their own palate. The peoples of the West had built their wheat culture around bread, the risen loaf. The Chinese, however, took the flour, and through their own unique culinary genius, transformed it into something entirely different, the noodle. Picture a kitchen in a northern Chinese city during the Tang Dynasty. It is filled with the comforting steam of a boiling pot. A cook with swift, practiced hands takes a lump of wheat dough and begins to stretch it. He pulls and folds in a mesmerizing dance-like motion until the single lump of dough has been transformed into a cascade of impossibly thin, delicate strands. These are dropped into the boiling water, cooked for a moment, and then served in a savory broth. It was a revolution in food. The noodle and other flour-based creations like dumplings and steamed buns became a cornerstone of northern Chinese cuisine. This was not a conquest. It was a fusion. Wheat did not replace rice, it complemented it. It wove itself into the fabric of Chinese culture, becoming a beloved part of its identity. The journey along the Silk Road was more than just a commercial exchange. It was a quiet culinary conversation that lasted for centuries. It was a testament to the incredible adaptability of both the grain and the human cultures that embraced it. Wheat, a child of the Middle East, had found a second home, and in doing so had enriched the world's table in a way no one could have ever predicted. Now, we must leave the ancient roads of Asia and return to the shores of Europe, to a moment in time when the world itself was about to double in size. The late 15th century. The medieval worldview, with its small, local horizons, was being shattered. New ideas were circulating, new technologies were emerging, and a new spirit of adventure and ambition was stirring. At the heart of this change was a new kind of vessel, the caravel, a small, nimble, yet incredibly sturdy ship, capable of sailing not just along the coasts, but out into the vast, unknown emptiness of the open ocean. And in 1492, 3 of these ships, led by an Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus, sailed west from Spain, seeking a new route to the riches of the East. They found, instead, a new world. This encounter between the old world and the new would trigger one of the most significant and often tragic transformations in human history. And at the heart of this transformation, carried in the holds of those small ships, was a passenger so humble it was almost invisible, a handful of wheat seeds. Imagine you are a Spanish colonist, a settler preparing for the long, terrifying voyage to the Americas. You pack your meager possessions, a few tools, some clothes, a sword, a cross. But perhaps the most important thing you pack is a small, rough spun cloth bag. Inside is a handful of wheat grains. This is not just food for the journey. This is a piece of home. It is the promise of bread in a strange and unknown land. It is a seed of civilization, as you understand it, that you intend to plant in the wilderness. The journey across the Atlantic is a brutal ordeal. For weeks, for months, the ship is a tiny, fragile speck of wood, tossed on an endless, indifferent ocean. The air in the crowded space below deck is foul. The food is infested with weevils. Men sicken and die. But in the darkness of the hold, protected in its small bag, the wheat sleeps. It is a tiny, dormant capsule of potential, a dream of golden fields carried across the vast, dark water. It is a biological time traveler, waiting for the moment it will be called upon to awaken. When the ship finally makes landfall, the seeds are brought ashore. They are planted in the soil of this new world, a soil that has never known this particular grass before. The first attempts were often failures. The climate was wrong, the rainfall was unpredictable. The native pests were unfamiliar, but the colonists were persistent. They were driven by a deep cultural hunger. The New World had its own incredible starches, corn, potatoes, cassava, but for the Europeans, these were not a true substitute. A meal without bread was not a proper meal. Bread was a profound part of their identity, their religion, their very sense of being civilized. The Eucharist, the central ritual of their faith, required bread made from wheat, and so they tried again and again. They carried the seeds with them as they pushed inland, from the Caribbean islands to the highlands of Mexico, to the river valleys of Peru. In each new settlement, one of the first and most important tasks was to find a suitable patch of ground and attempt to grow wheat. It was a slow, painstaking process of adaptation and acclimatization, but slowly, stubbornly, the wheat began to take hold. It was a biological invasion, quiet and inexorable, a single grasp beginning a conquest that would ultimately be far more transformative than any army. The arrival of wheat in the Americas was the beginning of a profound reshaping of the continent's ecology and its human societies. For the native peoples of the Americas, who had built their own complex and successful civilizations on a foundation of maize, beans, and squash, the relentless advance of this foreign grain was part of a larger catastrophic invasion that would disrupt their way of life forever. But for the wheat itself, this was a moment of unprecedented opportunity. It had crossed the final frontier. It had reached a new world, vast and fertile, a blank canvas waiting to be painted gold. Imagine the first successful harvest, a small, lonely field of golden wheat, ripening under a sun that had never shone on its ancestors. It stands in stark contrast to the surrounding landscape of dense forests or maize fields. It is an island of Europe, a piece of the old world transplanted and reborn. When that grain is harvested, ground into flour, and baked into the first loaf of bread in the New World, it is more than just food. It is a symbol of permanence. It is a declaration that the newcomers are here to stay. That small, sleeping seed carried in darkness across the ocean had awakened, and its journey was just beginning. The first tentative footholds of wheat in the Americas were just the beginning. The seed had crossed the ocean. Now it would conquer a continent. The story of its expansion is the story of the expansion of a new nation, a story of immense, open spaces and a relentless westward push. The narrow, forested coastal plains of the original colonies were not ideal for large-scale wheat farming. But beyond the Appalachian Mountains, a vast, new landscape unfolded, the Great Plains. This was a world unlike anything the European settlers had ever seen. An immense inland sea of grass, stretching for 1,000 miles from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. The sky was enormous. The horizon was a perfect, unbroken line, and the land itself was a deep, dark, incredibly fertile soil, built up over millennia by the decaying roots of the native prairie grasses. For the bison and the native peoples who hunted them, this was a perfectly balanced ecosystem. For the farmers who arrived with their plows and their bags of wheat seed, this was the promised land. Picture a lone sodbuster, a settler who has come west in a covered wagon seeking a new life. He stands on his newly claimed piece of land, a small, solitary figure in an overwhelming landscape. His first task is to break the prairie. This is brutal, back-breaking work. The roots of the prairie grass are so thick and tough that they form a dense, tangled sod that can be a foot deep. It takes a team of oxen and a specially designed steel plow to slice through it. The sound is of tearing roots, of groaning wood and metal, of a man's and an animal's raw effort against the stubborn earth. But once the sod is broken, the soil beneath is a farmer's dream. He plants his wheat seeds. And in this new environment, with its hot summers, its cold winters, and its moderate rainfall, the wheat thrives as it has thrived nowhere else on earth. The farmer's small, lonely plot is soon joined by another, and another. The vast, green and brown tapestry of the native prairie is slowly, inexorably, replaced by a new monochrome landscape, a checkerboard of wheat fields, stretching to the horizon in every direction. The scale of this transformation is difficult to comprehend. Within a few generations, a region that had been one of the world's great grasslands was turned into one of its great breadbaskets. The wild, diverse ecosystem was replaced by a monoculture of a single, domesticated grass. The bison were hunted to near extinction. The native tribes were pushed onto reservations. The land was tamed, measured, and divided. And at the heart of this immense change was the simple biological success of the wheat plant. New varieties were developed, specifically adapted to the harsh climate of the plains. Hard red winter wheat, brought by Mennonite immigrants from the steppes of Russia, could be planted in the autumn, survive the brutal winters under a blanket of snow, and be ready for an early summer harvest. This was the final piece of the puzzle. Now, the Great Plains of North America, from the prairies of Canada down through Kansas and Oklahoma and into Texas, became the undisputed wheat capital of the world. The small seed that had been born in the Middle East, that had been nurtured in Egypt, that had been spread by the Romans, and that had been carried across the ocean in a settler's small cloth bag, had finally found its ultimate home. It had covered a continent in a single, flowing, golden sea. The song of the mill, which had been sung for 1,000 years by wind and water, was about to change its tune. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, a new power was unleashed upon the world, a power born not of nature, but of human ingenuity. It was a power of fire, water, and iron. It was the power of steam, and it would transform the ancient, patient process of turning grain into flour into a thundering, industrial symphony. Let us leave the wide-open spaces of the American prairie for a moment and journey to a bustling, crowded city in the heart of industrializing England or America. The air is thick with the gray haze of coal smoke, and the dominant sound is the rhythmic clang of machinery and the shriek of steam whistles. Here, rising above the rows of brick factories and tenements, is a new kind of cathedral, the steam-powered flour mill. Step inside, and you are entering a different world. This is not the dusty, rustic piece of a village watermill. This is a multi-story labyrinth of belts, pulleys, and gears, all vibrating with a contained, terrifying power. And at the heart of it all, in a hot, hissing chamber, is the engine. It is a great, black beast of cast iron, a marvel of pistons, flywheels, and valves. It doesn't groan, it breathes. A deep, steady, rhythmic exhalation of steam. Chuff, chuff, a sound like the steady heartbeat of a sleeping iron giant. This is the new prime mover, a force that did not depend on the wind to blow or the river to flow. It could run day and night in any weather, with a power and consistency that was previously unimaginable. This steam-powered heart drove a revolution in milling technology. The old system of grinding grain between two flat, heavy stones was slow and inefficient. It was a batch process. But the new mills adopted a system of steel rollers. Grain was fed in at the top of the building, and through a complex, automated system of elevators and chutes, it would descend through a series of precisely calibrated steel rollers. Each set of rollers was slightly closer together than the last, gradually breaking down the wheat berry, separating the bran and the germ from the pure, white endosperm inside. The sound was no longer the deep rumble of stone on stone. It was a higher-pitched, continuous, metallic hum, a chorus of 100 spinning, vibrating parts, all working in perfect automated harmony. This new process was not only faster and more efficient, but it also produced a new kind of product, pure white flour. For centuries, flour had been a whole grain product, a brownish, nutrient-rich powder containing all the parts of the wheat berry. But the new roller mills could isolate the starchy endosperm, creating a flour that was prized for its fine texture, its pale color, and its long shelf life. The bran and the germ, which contained most of the vitamins and oils, were sifted out and sold as animal feed. White bread, once a rare luxury for the rich, now became the standard for the masses. It was a symbol of modernity, of progress, of a new, clean, industrial age. The old, dark, coarse peasant loaf was left behind. This transformation came at a nutritional cost, but at the time, it was seen as a triumph. The great steam mills, with their steady, iron breath and their intricate, automated guts, could produce more flour in a day than a medieval village could in a year. They were the engines that fed the rapidly growing cities of the Industrial Revolution, the essential link between the vast, new wheat fields of the Americas and the hungry mouths of a new, urban working class. While the great steam engines were revolutionizing the processing of wheat, another, far quieter revolution was taking place, not in a noisy factory, but in the peaceful, sunlit rows of the experimental farm and the sterile silence of the laboratory. The focus of this revolution was not on how to grind the grain, but on the grain itself. Humanity was no longer content to simply plant and harvest what nature provided. It was now beginning to consciously and scientifically redesign the wheat plant, to mold it and shape it to meet our ever-growing needs. This was the dawn of modern agronomy, the science of crops and soils. And its practitioners were a new kind of farmer, patient, meticulous, and armed with a new understanding of genetics, pioneered by the quiet work of an Austrian monk named Gregor Mendel. They were plant breeders, and their goal was to create new varieties of wheat that were stronger, more reliable, and above all, more productive than anything that had come before. Picture a man in the early 20th century. He is not a peasant farmer, but a university-trained scientist. He spends his days not behind a plow, but walking through carefully cultivated test plots. Each plot contains a different variety of wheat, each one labeled with a small wooden stake. He carries a notebook and he observes. He measures the height of the stalks. He counts the number of grains in each head. He notes which varieties are the first to ripen, and which ones seem to be most resistant to the ever-present threats of drought, frost, and disease. His most important work is done with a pair of fine tweezers and a small pair of scissors. It is a delicate, surgical procedure. He chooses 2 different parent plants, each with a desirable trait. Perhaps one is very high-yielding, but susceptible to a devastating fungal disease called rust. The other might have a low yield, but possesses a natural genetic resistance to that same disease. He carefully opens the flower of the high-yielding plant and with his scissors removes its male parts, the stamens, to prevent it from pollinating itself. Then, with his tweezers, he collects a tiny bit of pollen from the disease-resistant plant and gently brushes it onto the stigma of the first plant. He has just performed an act of controlled, intentional creation. He has brokered a marriage between two plants, hoping that their offspring will inherit the best qualities of both parents, a high yield and strong disease resistance. He ties a small bag over the pollinated flower to protect it from stray pollen, and he waits. Most of these crosses will be failures. The offspring might be weak or sterile or simply inherit the worst traits of both parents. But the plant breeder is a master of patience. He makes thousands of these crosses, season after season, year after year. He plants the resulting seeds, he observes. He selects the most promising offspring, and he crosses them again. It is a slow, painstaking process of selection and refinement, a form of accelerated, human-guided evolution. But over time, it yielded miraculous results. The scientists in their labs and their test fields created new dwarf varieties of wheat. These plants were shorter and sturdier than their traditional tall-stalked ancestors. They didn't lodge or fall over in the wind and rain when their grain heads became heavy. And because they invested less energy in growing a long, useless stalk, they could pour more of their energy into what really mattered, producing grain. They were incredibly high, yielding, capable of producing 2 or 3 times more wheat per acre than the old varieties. This quiet, intellectual work, carried out in the silence of the lab and the peace of the field, was arguably more important to the future of humanity than any battle or political treaty. It was a silent, green, and deeply intelligent revolution. Our story, which has spanned millennia and crossed continents, now comes to focus on a single man, a man who embodied the quiet scientific revolution in agriculture and who would use its power not for profit or for glory, but for a simple, profoundly humanitarian goal: to feed a hungry world. His name was Norman Borlaug, and he was, in many ways, the man who saved 1 billion lives. Borlaug was not a politician or a celebrity. He was the humble, determined son of Iowa corn farmers, a man who felt more at home in a dusty field than in a boardroom. Armed with a PhD in plant pathology, he went to work in the 1940s in a remote, underfunded experimental agricultural station in Mexico. At the time, the world was on the brink of a crisis. Demographers and economists were issuing dire warnings of a population bomb. The world's population was exploding, but food production, particularly in the developing nations of Asia and Latin America, was stagnating. Mass famine seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Borlaug's mission was simple: to develop a high-yielding, disease-resistant variety of wheat that could thrive in the specific climate of Mexico. The task was enormous. The local wheat varieties were tall, low-yielding, and constantly being devastated by epidemics of stem rust. For nearly 2 decades, Borlaug worked in relative obscurity, toiling under the hot Mexican sun, often 7 days a week. He and his small team of Mexican scientists were relentless. They used the same patient techniques of crossed breeding that had been developed in the labs of the West, making tens of thousands of individual crosses between different wheat varieties. He was a man possessed by a fierce urgency. To speed up the process, he developed an ingenious technique called shuttle breeding. He would plant his wheat crosses in the central highlands of Mexico during the summer. Then he would take the seeds from that harvest and immediately drive them hundreds of miles north to a second test station in the Sonoran Desert, where he could plant a second crop during the winter. By getting 2 growing seasons in a single year, he could cut the time it took to develop a new variety in half. It was a grueling schedule, but it worked. Finally, after years of painstaking work, he had his breakthrough. He succeeded in crossing a high-yielding American dwarf wheat with a disease-resistant Japanese variety. The result was a new semi-dwarf wheat that was incredibly high, yielding, resistant to rust, and perfectly adapted to the growing conditions in Mexico and other similar climates. The results were astonishing. Within a few years of its introduction, Mexico, which had long been a net importer of wheat, became self-sufficient. Its wheat harvest tripled. But Borlaug knew that his work was not done. His true goal was to avert the looming global famine. In the mid-1960s, he took his miracle seeds to the 2 countries that were facing the most desperate situations, India and Pakistan. The situation there was dire. They were on the brink of mass starvation. Borlaug faced immense bureaucratic and cultural resistance. But he persisted, working directly with local farmers, demonstrating the potential of his new seeds. In 1968, the harvest came in. It was a record. Pakistan became self-sufficient in wheat. India's harvest was so large they had to use schools and movie theaters to store the surplus grain. The famine had been averted. This was the beginning of what came to be known as the Green Revolution. Borlaug's high-yield wheat, along with new varieties of rice and modern agricultural techniques, spread throughout Asia and Latin America, dramatically increasing food production and saving hundreds of millions of people from starvation. For his work, Norman Borlaug was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. In his acceptance speech, he was typically humble. He was not a hero, he said. He was just a scientist who had the privilege of working with a team of dedicated people, all focused on a simple, peaceful vision that every man, woman, and child on earth should have the right to a daily loaf of bread. Let us now pull our focus back, ascending high into the cool, thin air, until the entire planet hangs beneath us like a beautiful, swirling blue marble. From this Olympian vantage point, we can see not borders or nations, but the great sweeping patterns of the Earth's surface, the deep blue of the oceans, the stark white of the ice caps, the greens and browns of the land. And if we look closely at certain times of the year, we can see vast geometric patches of a single uniform color, a soft, shimmering gold. These are the world's great breadbaskets, the immense continental-scale fields where wheat continues its quiet global reign. Look at the heart of North America. The Great Plains, which we saw being broken by the first sodbusters, are now a single, integrated agricultural machine. An ocean of grain stretching from the prairie provinces of Canada down to the plains of Texas. This is the kingdom of hard red winter wheat, a landscape of immense scale and profound monolithic simplicity. In the summer, when the harvest is underway, you can see the lights of 1,000 giant combine harvesters moving through the fields at night, like a fleet of ships on a golden sea. Now, let your gaze drift across the Atlantic. Look at the vast, flat expanse that stretches from the Danube River eastward across Ukraine and into southern Russia. This is the famous Chernozem, the Black Earth region. The soil here is legendary, a deep, dark, incredibly fertile loam that is among the richest on the planet. For centuries, this has been the breadbasket of Europe, a landscape that has been fought over by empires and ideologies, but which has, through it all, continued to produce its reliable life-giving harvest of wheat. It is a land of wide horizons and endless, gently rolling fields of gold. Let's cross the continents of Asia and look down upon the lands of Australia. Here, in the vast, semi-arid interior, in what is known as the Wheat Belt, another great agricultural miracle has taken place. Australian farmers, through dry land farming techniques and specially adapted wheat varieties, have turned a landscape that is often on the brink of drought into another of the world's major grain exporters. The fields here shimmer under a hot, intense sun, a testament to human resilience in a harsh and unforgiving environment. These great bread baskets, along with others in Argentina, in China, in India, are now all interconnected. They are nodes in a vast global network of production and trade. The wheat harvested in Kansas may be loaded onto a ship in the Gulf of Mexico, sail through the Panama Canal, and end up as noodles in a bowl in Tokyo. The grain from Ukraine may be milled into flour in Rotterdam and baked into baguettes in Paris. We have built a global food system of incredible complexity and efficiency, a system that, for the most part, keeps the majority of the world's 7 billion people fed. And the silent, unassuming foundation of this entire massive globalized system is still that one: single, domesticated grass. It is the common currency of calories, the universal language of sustenance, a golden thread that ties our modern fragmented world together. But now, our journey is nearing its end. We have traveled through deep time, from the wild grasses of the Fertile Crescent to the global breadbaskets of the modern world. We have seen wheat as a divine gift, as a tool of empire, as a passenger on the Silk Road, and as the subject of scientific revolution. Now, it is time to bring the story home. Let us descend from our global vantage point, down from the scale of continents and nations, and into a quiet, warm, and familiar space. Let us come to rest in a kitchen. The air here is still. The late afternoon light is slanting through the window, illuminating swirling motes of dust. On a simple wooden counter sits a bowl. Inside is a small mound of fine, pale white flour. It is the end product of that long industrial process we saw earlier, a substance that seems almost inert, almost lifeless. Beside it sits a small packet of yeast, a glass of warm water, and a pinch of salt. And now, a final act of transformation is about to begin. An act of domestic alchemy that is in many ways as magical as anything we have seen on our long journey. A pair of hands, your hands pour the warm water into the bowl. The yeast is sprinkled over the surface and begins to awaken, to bloom, to come alive. The salt is added, and then the hands begin to mix. The flour, at first dry and dusty, begins to absorb the water, to cohere, to form a sticky, shaggy mass. It is a moment of creation, of bringing disparate elements together to form a new whole. The dough is tipped out onto a lightly floured surface. And now the real work, the real magic begins. The process of kneading. It is a rhythm as old as bread itself. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. Your hands and arms work the dough, stretching and compressing it. You are not just mixing it, you are developing it. You are encouraging the gluten, the proteins within the flour to link up to form long elastic chains. The dough begins to change under your hands. It transforms from a rough, sticky lump into something smooth, elastic, and alive. It feels warm and responsive to the touch. It has a life, a potential all its own. Once the dough is kneaded, it is placed back in the bowl, covered with a damp cloth, and left in a warm, quiet corner to rise. And now, we must do what our earliest farming ancestors learned to do. We must wait, and in the silence of the kitchen, a miracle happens. The yeast, the tiny living organisms we introduced, begins its work. It consumes the sugars in the flour and releases its gentle, invisible breath, tiny bubbles of carbon dioxide. The dough begins to swell, to grow, to rise, doubling in size, straining against the cloth that covers it. It is the same magic the ancient Egyptians discovered, the breath of life filling the once inert flour. After it has risen, the dough is gently punched down, shaped into a loaf and left for its final proof. And then it is placed into a hot oven. Here, in the intense, dry heat, the final transformation takes place. The yeast gives one last, powerful push, a phenomenon known as oven spring, making the loaf light and airy. The starches in the flour gelatinize, and the proteins of the gluten set, creating the soft internal structure we call the crumb. And on the outside, a complex chemical reaction, the Maillard reaction, takes place, turning the surface a beautiful, deep, golden brown and creating the hundreds of aromatic compounds that give freshly baked bread its intoxicating, universally beloved smell. When the loaf is finally taken from the oven and placed on a rack to cool, it is no longer just flour and water. It is a new creation. It is a testament to a 10,000-year-long partnership. It is a small edible monument to human ingenuity and patience. The sound of the crust crackling as it cools is the final satisfying note in a long and ancient song. And so, we come to the end of our story, a story that began with a single, fragile blade of wild grass, swaying in the warm winds of the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago. A story that has taken us on a journey through the rise and fall of civilizations across oceans and continents, through the quiet work of monks and the brilliant insights of scientists. And it ends here, in this kitchen with this warm, fragrant, perfect loaf of bread. Think for a moment of everything that is contained within that single loaf. In its golden crust is the warmth of 1,000,000 summer suns. In its soft crumb is the taste of the rain and the richness of the soil. In its very substance is the genetic legacy of that first, mutated plant that learned to hold onto its seeds. And in its transformation from grain to flour to bread is the accumulated wisdom of countless human generations, the patience of the first gatherers, the faith of the first farmers, the ingenuity of the Egyptian bakers, the logistical genius of the Romans, the devotion of the medieval monks, the ambition of the explorers, the scientific brilliance of the plant breeders, and the simple, loving touch of the hands that baked it. One small grain of wheat. It is a universe in miniature, a silent testament to our long, complex, and intimate relationship with the earth that sustains us. It is the symbol of our journey from wandering nomads to builders of a global civilization. It is the taste of home, the staff of life, a simple, profound, and enduring miracle. And now, as our journey concludes, perhaps you can feel the warmth of that freshly baked loaf. Let the comforting thought of it fill your mind. It is a symbol of peace, of sustenance, of a cycle completed. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to solve. The harvest is in. The work is done. It is time to rest. Let the story of the wheat, with its long, slow, patient rhythms, guide you into a deep and peaceful sleep. Let your thoughts drift like seeds on a gentle wind, and allow yourself to rest, knowing that the world is sustained by quiet miracles, and that you are a part of that long, unbroken story. Rest now, sleep well.